To introduce these notes on viruses, I would like to just read this excerpt from The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. A virus is a small capsule made of membranes and proteins. The capsule contains one or more strands of DNA or RNA, which are long molecules that contain the software for making a copy of that virus. Some biologists classify viruses as life forms because they are not strictly known to be alive. Viruses are kind of ambiguous, neither alive nor dead. They carry on their existence in the hinterlands between life and non-life. Viruses that are outside cells merely sit there. Nothing happens. They are dead. They can even form crystals. Viruses, virus particles that lie around in the blood or mucus may seem dead, but those particles are waiting for something to come along. They have a sticky surface. If a cell comes along and touches that virus, the stickiness of the virus matches the stickiness of the cell, and the virus clings to the cell. The cell feels the virus sticking to it and enfolds that virus and drags it inside. Once the virus enters, it becomes a Trojan horse. It switches on and begins to replicate or copy itself. A virus is a parasite. It can't live on its own. It can only make copies of itself inside a cell using the cell's materials and machinery to get the job done. All living things carry viruses in their cells. Even fungi and bacteria are inhabited by viruses and are occasionally destroyed by them. A virus makes copies of itself inside a cell until eventually that cell gets pigged with viruses and pops, and the viruses spill out of the cell. Some viruses can bud through a cell wall like drips out of a faucet. Drip, drip, drip. Copy, copy, copy. That's the way HIV works. The faucet runs and runs until the cell is exhausted, consumed, and destroyed. If enough cells are destroyed, that host dies. A virus doesn't really want to kill its host. That's not in its best interest, because then the virus will be trapped unless it can jump fast enough out of the dying host into a new host. Viruses can seem alive. They seem alive when they multiply, but in another sense they are obviously dead. Only machines, subtle ones to be sure, but strictly mechanical, no more alive than a jackhammer. Viruses are molecular sharks, a motive without a mind. Compact, hard, logical, totally selfish. The virus is dedicated to making copies of itself, which it can do occasionally with incredible speed. Its prime directive is to replicate. Finally, viruses are too small to be seen. Here is a way to imagine the size of a virus. Consider the island of Manhattan shrunk to the space between the lines on the pages of a typical book. This quote-unquote Manhattan could easily hold 9 million viruses. If you could magnify this Manhattan and it were full of viruses, you would see little figures clustered like the lunch crowd on Fifth Avenue. Another way to visualize them, 100 million, 1 with 9 zeros. Okay? Crystallized polioviruses could cover the period at the end of a sentence on a piece of typewritten paper. There could be 250 Woodstock festivals of viruses sitting on that period, the combined populations of Great Britain and France, and you would never know. This gives you some perspective on what we understand about viruses. Let me continue. This quote from Peter Medawar, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, kind of sums up our history with viruses. Let me introduce this discussion by defining what we know about a virus at this point. At present, we know that a virus is basically a piece of DNA or its cousin RNA. Simple viruses are made of this cousin, RNA. Surrounding, or this piece of information basically is surrounded by a protective protein. That protein is called a capsid. So in all honesty, there's not much to a virus. Okay? Information in a protective covering. Since we first discovered viruses with the help of the electron microscope back in the 1930s, scientists have been trying to figure out, are viruses alive or not alive? At this point, scientists think they could be basically some sort of link showing us how living organisms came about. And there's a number of reasons why scientists really, even though they will taxonomically classify viruses into different groups, don't really call them living organisms at present. Okay? At present, the reasons for their failure to qualify as a living organism has to do with, one, they have no metabolism. Viruses can be stored for hundreds, thousands of, hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, since they don't require any food or energy. Second, they don't respond to their environment. Okay? Viruses can be kept in the cold. Anthrax virus was mailed in an envelope. And so viruses can be stored in, again, lots of different environments. They don't respond or change to it. Viruses don't grow. Okay? A virus does not reproduce. Okay? The only way a virus can multiply is by turning, or utilizing, I should say, the information mechanism inside its host cell. And so it must incorporate itself into that DNA, and at that point, the cell, the host cell, will begin to make new viruses. The virus itself doesn't do anything but just kind of short-circuit part of that DNA. For these reasons, viruses are not considered to be living organisms. As you can see from the following slides, scientists have discovered that viruses can come in many, many varieties with many different shapes and appearances. You can see in my slide here the human immunodeficiency virus that leads eventually to the illness of AIDS. It's made up of a protein creating a icosahedron, a 20-sided protein protective coat on that virus. You can see the Ebola virus, okay? A horrific hemorrhagic virus. I mean, it's got its unique shape. It almost looks like a worm of sorts. You can see some viruses come in spherical shapes. An example of that would be the herpes virus that you can see here in this slide. Okay. Another one, smallpox, infamous smallpox. Okay. Used to be a plague upon mankind. It comes in what's almost like a capsule shape, and the list goes on and on. You can see, other viruses that we are familiar with, that you've probably either been infected with or read about. Okay, some of them, such as, again, that spherical shape as the appearance of the common flu. Okay. In the news recently, again, you've perhaps read about West Nile virus. This virus can not only make you ill, but it can kill you. It's one that's of serious concern in the Southwest, Texas in particular, because it's transmitted from mosquitoes to birds, or birds to mosquitoes, as the case may be, and again can eventually lead to being transmitted to humans. A few years ago, some of you may recall, okay, the SARS virus. It cropped up in China. And again, severe acute respiratory syndrome. That's what that acronym SARS stands for. And therefore, this virus basically started to cause your lungs to get flooded with fluid, and you basically had your lungs shut down. Cowpox. Cowpox is a form of that smallpox. It's a cousin of the smallpox, and it was actually used to create a vaccine for smallpox. And then, many of you have been infected with or observed, many of you have been vaccinated, not infected with hepatitis B. And we, again, see individuals crop up. Hepatitis B can be gotten through, poor sanitary conditions. These are just a few of those shapes. Another interesting shape is this bacteriophage. Now it gets its name, bacteriophage, basically because it is a virus that specifically will attack a bacterial cell. And you'll notice it almost looks like it's got this landing gear on it. And that landing gear hooks onto the outer shell of a bacterial cell. And then the bacteriophage injects its DNA into the bacterial cell. And again, it's not very hard to infect a bacteria because there's only a small piece of DNA in there, usually one strand and maybe a circular loop, and the bacteriophage will infect either one of them. You'll notice in this slide that the T4 bacteriophages have already attacked this E. coli bacteria, and again, at this point they've short-circuited that E. coli DNA and basically gotten the E. coli to make hundreds and hundreds of new bacteriophages, and that's what you see in the upper left corner of the picture. So many of them have filled up this bacterial cell that in a sense it's almost like gotten filled up like a water balloon with viruses, and the bacteria, and at that point the bacterial cell just bursts open, and what now? From one infected cell you have hundreds now of bacteriophages that can infect hundreds of cells. Again, sharing some additional information. Again, the variety of viral shapes. Tobacco mosaic virus, which is shown in this picture, is, you can guess, okay, one that infects plants, the tobacco plant. It's an important virus in the sense that it can cause lots of harm to a variety of plants beyond just the tobacco plant. Other plants that are basically infected by this virus include ones such as the tomato, the cucumber, the squash, the spinach, peppers. And for those of you that like to garden, this virus can also, wreak havoc amongst your ornamental plants that you may enjoy having in your garden. So again, we think of viruses as infecting us and causing us to be ill, but they can also infect bacterial cells, as I've shown you, plants, as I've shown you. So viruses are everywhere and can harm or affect, again, all sorts of living organisms. What I would like to talk to you next about are the virus lifestyles, as scientists oftentimes refer to them. Now, there are two basic lifestyles that viruses exhibit. Okay? And they get their names basically from how quickly the virus is visible or how quickly the virus multiplies within the host organism. The first lifestyle that I would like to share with you is one that's known as the lytic lifestyle. The root lytic comes from the word lyse, L-Y-S-E, and the word lyse basically means to clean, to open up. And so if something is lysed, it's dissolved away. Okay? And so what happens with a virus that exhibits this type of lifestyle is the virus enters a cell, the virus immediately short-circuits the DNA of that cell, and at that point, since it's now incorporated itself into the DNA of the host cell, it will begin to just have that host cell make copy after copy after copy after copy, just continuously, almost like a copy machine, okay? And so that the cell becomes filled up with just these viral entities, and eventually, okay, as the cell gets filled with these viral entities, it will swell and swell and swell, and that cell membrane, that container for the cell, will eventually just burst open. At this point, once that cell is destroyed and all these viral entities, these viruses are released, they can each, again, attach themselves to another cell, and the process begins immediately. This type of virus is what we see with the flu, okay, or Ebola. In both cases, the virus enters the host, a human, and very quickly we start to feel very sick. And in the case of the flu, within a day, after someone, coughs on you with the flu virus, you're just feeling miserable, runny nose, congestion. In the case of the Ebola virus, once you're infected, usually through the transfer of fluids, what happens is, since it's a hemorrhagic virus, that virus short circuits the host as it's making more and more of itself, and the person starts to bleed from all of their orifices. And at that point, due to the blood coming out of the nose, the eyes, the mouth, wherever, blood transfer can occur and the Ebola can jump to a new host. This happens very quickly, which is why these viruses are called lytic viruses. The second lifestyle that I would like to share with you, discuss with you, is known as a lysogenic. And again, lyse, to dissolve away, eventually producing more viruses. Genic is a term that refers to something over the course of an organism's life. And so what happens here is this virus builds itself into the DNA of the host, and every time the host's cells divide, new viruses are also produced as a result of that cell division. And so over a longer period of time, okay, more and more and more viruses are added to the host, okay, so that the host eventually, over a period of time, will get ill and die. The most notorious of this type of virus is HIV. I mean, an individual gets infected with HIV through the transfer of fluids, and that HIV incorporates itself into the white blood cells of the host. Once incorporated into the white blood cells of the host, every time the host cells carry out cell division, then more and more of the HIV are produced. Now, what happens is this also leads to periods where those white blood cells are destroyed as a result of basically being worn down through the use and creation of these HIV viruses. And what makes HIV so notorious, such a kind of a horrific viral invader, is that it destroys the white blood cells which are designed to protect us from such entities as viruses. And so, in a sense, its lifestyle is designed to allow it to survive in an environment where it shouldn't. There's nothing to say, to protect us, because it has destroyed our white blood cells. And that's why individuals eventually come down with what we would say is AIDS. AIDS is just a series of, sicknesses due to our inability to protect ourselves, because HIV has destroyed that white blood cell, our immune system. So that's a lysogenic lifestyle. The last thing I just want to talk to you about for a little bit here is the idea of protecting ourselves from a virus. After all, it seems like it would be a challenge to protect yourself from something that's not alive. How do you kill something that's not alive? Well, we're fortunate in that we have an immune system. And again, the purpose of that immune system is to protect us from foreign invaders. Viruses qualify as these foreign invaders. Our phagocytes, our white blood cells, as they're often referred to, come in there's a number of different versions of them. But the bottom line is this process of phagocytosis. Phago is Latin for to eat or devour. Cytosis. Cyto, cell. So the process of eating other cells. And so phagocytosis is what happens when these white blood cells detect okay, a foreign invader, they surround them, swallow them up, and use enzymes to destroy them. Now, again, this is just one method. When others have failed, again, we look for alternative medicines that can be utilized to help us to understand, okay, to help us to try to protect ourselves from viruses, not understand. And so one of those is interferon. And again, many of the HIV viruses are proteins that basically find ways to attach themselves to a viral cell and prevent that virus, okay, from attaching itself to one of the host cells. And so most of the medicines, such as interferon, what they do is they either attach themselves to the virus so it can't attach to our host cells, or they attach themselves to our cells and shut off the means by which a viral cell can bind to it and inject its DNA into it. And so there are possible medicines that can protect us. But protecting ourselves from a virus is a challenge. We can't just poison it with an antibiotic like we can with a bacterial cell.